Welcome to a new and special episode of Plan C Ocean Interventions to Address Climate Change and the Carbon Curve. As always, I'm your host, Anna Madlener, MRV Manager at the Carbon to Sea Initiative.
And I'm Naeem Merchant, host of the Carbon Curve and Executive Director of Carbon Removal Canada. And this is a special episode between our two podcasts, which will air on both of our streams. So should we do some quick intros?
Yeah, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So the Carbon Curve is a podcast about the policies, technologies, and collective action needed to remove billions of tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and fend off the worst effects of climate change.
Awesome. And we are the Plan C podcast, which features ocean-based climate solutions that seek to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, discussing risks and benefits of these options, as well as matters of governance, stakeholder engagement, ethics, and politics. I'd also like to send a warm shout out to my co-host, Will Burns, who is the co-executive director of the Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal and an essential part of the Plan C podcast. Unfortunately, his travel got cancelled last minute, so he can't join us today, but he will be back. With Naeem and I is Leonard Bach, who is a scientist working on ocean alkalinity enhancement out of the University of Tasmania in Australia. Welcome, Leonard.
Hi.
Some may recognize Leonard's voice from a previous episode on the Plan C podcast where he discussed iron fertilization together with Veronica Tamzet. So let's provide a little bit more context about this episode and why we are doing this joint episode together. I'm really excited for it. We are actually sitting once more together in person to share with both of our podcasts some insights into the Carbon to Sea annual convening that is taking place as we speak outside the doors of this room. So you may hear some mumbling in the background, which is a vibrant testimony to what we've heard about all day, I think. For those who don't know Carbon to Sea, we are an initiative that is focused on assessing the efficacy and safety of ocean alkalinity enhancement. And for 3 years now, we have hosted an annual convening bringing together scientists, entrepreneurs, policymakers, and many more people to discuss that state on how it's going. So we're here to reflect. And I think, Naeem, do you want to set the stage a little bit? It's 5:30 p.m. where we're at, what we've been doing all day.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've been at, as you mentioned, this annual convening, and I just want to say the Carbon to Sea folks did a wonderful job, as they did last year when I attended too, to, bring together the community and the ecosystem around ocean alkalinity enhancement and kind of starting the day talking about the scientific progress that's been made and some of the scientific updates that have happened around OAE. And then the latter part of the day focused on like the strategy for kind of what's next and the way forward, especially around governance and market mechanisms and those sorts of supporting infrastructure around the important science and research that's going on. So I thought it was really well organized, really well attended, some great energy in the room and some wonderful progress being made. And of course, the Carbon to Sea team putting on a great event, as always.
Thank you for that kind summary. I do wonder if you think it's helpful for your listeners who may be so far a little less familiar with ocean alkalinity enhancement than perhaps the Plan C listeners, to maybe put Leonard on the spot and share a little description and explanation of what ocean alkalinity enhancement is. I've heard you describe it in really fantastic and simple ways before.
Alrighty, that's a tough one. So we heard today a lot that the word is not the best, ocean alkalinity enhancement, because it means nothing to the public. But okay, here we go again. All right. Alkalinity can be thought of maybe as some sort of sponge that sucks up CO2, and the CO2 is not in some sort of particulate matter. It's not in biomass or anything like that. It's dissolved in seawater, and the more alkaline the seawater is, the more capacity there is in seawater to keep CO2 locked in. So in somewhat more technical terms, still simple enough, I hope. So we assess if raising ocean pH is a sustainable way to lock in more CO2 in seawater, because the ocean pH controls how much can be stored, essentially. Well, it's not chemically fully correct, but good enough, I hope.
Mm-hmm. Over to you.
I know. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I'm wondering, we heard a lot about ocean alkalinity enhancement progress over the past year. And, as I mentioned, kind of started the day with kind of talking about the scientific and technical progress. But But how would you kind of summarize the progress in the current state of ocean alkalinity enhancement in terms of where we are today?
All right. Well, this convening has been held, I think it's the third year this year, isn't it? I'm generally optimistic. I think we're at this point in a marathon. You know, when we came here 3 years ago, when you start a marathon, everyone's enthusiastic. All the people are around you, and you have that community feeling. And it's going on. What's going on? We can do it. We'll manage. You know, it's going to be hard, but you haven't actually experienced how hard it really is. Mm-hmm. And I think now coming into this third year, identifying the issue is getting a lot of pushback, because 3 years ago no one knew about it, and now people start to know about it, and we get pushback on all sorts of things, on the science, and we're basically on this 10th kilometer of the marathon, and we know we got 30 more to do, right? So I assume some folks will drop out of this research field. The original hype is kind of phasing out, and now we have to show that we can do good science also when it's getting a bit harder.
Yeah. I think it's also actually good in a way that the hype dies down, right? Like, it's a testament to we are actually getting results. We are actually, as you say, learning the first things. You were part of an opening session where we had 5 researchers across sort of the state of scientific progress, sharing insights, not only about your own research, but really generally about the progress. And I think we separated it into the efficacy, the safety, scalability aspects. And you talked about environmental impacts and the safety aspect of ocean alkalinity enhancement. For those who maybe are less familiar with the quantification of ocean alkalinity enhancement, which needs to address how much carbon was actually removed because of the intervention. And then there is a question of how safe that was, right? And you shared some really interesting perspective, I think, about what we're actually studying. And a lot of the biological research has been focused on what you called, I think, no man's land of OAE. So I wonder if you can share a little bit more about that and why it's still very important to sort of set the stage and what the next step forward is from there.
Yeah, right. Okay, so for context, the environmental safety aspect that is one potential concern is that because we change the ocean alkalinity, we change ocean pH and all these things, that some organisms would not like it, and there may be changes in community composition and so on. And the thing is that we as a community, as the ocean alkalinity enhancement community, is evolved out of the carbon cycle community that studied carbon in the ocean. And for that particular reason, we are really good at studying carbon. And so we look at carbon. But the argument was that carbon is not the actual problem, because, if you raise alkalinity slightly, it really doesn't take that much to have a significant impact on the climate. So it doesn't really have strong effects on the ocean environment, because just for an example, there's already a gradient in ocean alkalinity naturally, and that gradient is probably larger than what ocean alkalinity enhancement could ever do. And there's marginal seas that have very high alkalinity, and life is thriving in these. So the argument was that because our experimental studies, they always test a very high perturbation range. And because at the bottom of our hearts, we already know that the perturbation may not be that stressful. So as an experimentalist, you say, we have to pull out the sledgehammer to see something, right? But the sledgehammer is not what OAE is. So the argument was, okay, we're kind of looking into OAE no man's land, because we set up our experiment in a way that we see something, but that range is perhaps not the relevant range for ocean alkalinity enhancement as such.
To clarify maybe and put that into even more context, Leonard, it's still very relevant and correct probably to start by studying those more extreme concentrations, I suppose. Can you share a little bit more about why it's still important to start in that area, though, of research, Leonard? It's still valid and insightful. And what are the things that we did learn from those studies?
Yeah, no, I don't blame any studies. The studies are great and the experiments are very important, and two good things can be taken from them. So in the first place, you could always argue, if you go really extreme and you still don't see much, that's then probably a good sign. And the other thing is, and that is, I think, much more important argument, is when you go extreme, you can often get like mechanistic insights on how an organism really responds at the core of its physiology, biology. So there is high scientific value in that. And the problem is not that these experiments are being made. The problem is that they are contextualized incorrectly, I think, because when you have a perturbation that is orders of magnitude higher than what is plausible under ocean alkalinity enhancement, and you still call it ocean alkalinity enhancement, that is just not the right context, right? To give you another example on which I like to make, we studied ocean acidification for quite a while, and ocean acidification is projected to change the pH from around about 8.1 to 7.7 or something like that in the worst case, right? So you would not call an experiment where you compare a pH of 8.1 with the responses of pH 5 or 6. You wouldn't call that ocean acidification research, right? That is basic research on pH physiology or responsiveness to pH changes, right? But it's not ocean acidification. And that context is then the problem, really. It's not the experiments themselves. Many of them are very informative, but they have to be contextualized correctly.
I want to also, speaking of contextualizing, pick up one thing that you said in the beginning, which was that the hype sort of died down. I think it's maybe more accurately portrayed as we're starting to move the needle and focus more on specific aspects. And I think one thing that's a testimony to that is we have for the first time today posters from all of like a bunch of different researchers working on OAE in the hallway. And I wonder if you can speak to what that shows or should show. If people were here, right, like what should they take away from the fact that there's a hallway filled with posters just on ocean alkalinity enhancement? Like, yes, maybe there's a little bit less hype or maybe there's more focus. But broadly speaking across the board, what did that feel like?
So I suppose it means that we're just having way more data to share, right? You've seen the talk by David Keller, who showed the explosion of research that happened in the last 3-4 years on this topic. And now we need just more space to accommodate for the various results that exist. So the poster session is the way to go here.
And maybe transitioning that over to the most important thing that I think we've heard a number of times in a variety of contexts today, which is community engagement. And I guess also like what you said in the beginning, how to talk about OAE. Naeem, I want to shift the conversation a little bit similarly to how it shifted in the room today and hear from you what you thought are some of the comparisons between other carbon removal pathways, given that you've obviously had much more engagement with other pathways and are more engaged in that.
And this is an area that I'm really excited to learn more about. So at Carbon Removal Canada, we are technology agnostic, right? We look at all permanent carbon removal methods, but we recognize that each of these different methods require different policy supports, different regulatory supports. And we're really keen to kind of get deeper on OAE and ocean-based methods in general. But I think that the point around kind of the conversation shifting towards community engagement and governance actually kind of reinforces that ongoing kind of maturity of the field, that these are the things that we're talking about because we're doing more of it or that more field trials are happening that require broader community engagement to actually make these things happen. And so for me, that starts to feel really familiar with other methods of carbon removal that are maybe further along on kind of technology readiness or levels of research or commercialization or whatever kind of metric you want to use. But I think one area where I think there still feels like there's a difference in terms of how I've at least observed other kind of areas of carbon removal is that there still feels like there's kind of a lack of cohesion amongst the different research activities that are going on. And it's not clear to me as someone who doesn't kind of spend a lot of time in depth in this area of like how all of this fits together, how are all the major research questions being answered, how are we making progress like in the overall research landscape for ocean carbon removal. And again, I'm sure that there's someone compiling this or contextualizing this, but it does still feel like a lot of disparate research efforts, and at least as an outside observer, wasn't entirely clear to me how all of this is fitting together in terms of what's needed in terms of the advancement of the field as a whole. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, and in ways is actually very encouraging to hear because, well, we're recording this on day 1. Day 2 tomorrow we'll focus on workshops where this is exactly what we're spending time on, because I think, I wonder how you would describe it from a research perspective, Lennart, but I do think that like what happened in the last 1 to 2 years were, as you said, the first instances of experiments and the first attempts at doing it even, which by nature had to be pretty bespoke. And now, because we're starting to see data, we can start building these, I think, more coordinated agendas. But I agree that it was both said in presentations, I believe, and is certainly talked about in sort of the hallway conversations, that this type of coordination is absolutely needed in order to now really go to the next step. Yeah, I wonder how you would describe it from a scientific or like academic perspective.
You mean a stricter agenda of what is needed rather than like the pioneering times where everyone could do anything and it'll be exciting regardless? Yeah, I mean, basically. Of course, it kind of like the low-hanging fruits have been picked to some extent, right? So the scientific questions become more complex, more detailed. And then, of course, also that's perhaps also why by saying the hype died, it's more like getting realistic about it, really, right? Initially, everyone was like stoked, okay, so this is a super exciting topic and it seems to make all sense, and all of a sudden you get all this new data in and it shows something completely different and nitty-gritty problems. So yeah, I mean, it's just a normal evolution of the research field. There's this Gartner hype cycle, which I like to cite all the time, and I think we are on that declining phase, hopefully hitting the bottom soon and getting into that phase where you slowly progress and get more confident again after some overconfidence initially.
I don't know that that's true for like every individual sort of challenge of OAE. I feel like MRV, for example, so monitoring, reporting, and verification, the quantification of CDR, I feel like was always is presented as being extremely challenging for OAE for various reasons, and we've had a number of episodes covering that. And today we actually had presentations that demonstrated real data from a OAE deployment where a signal was measurable for certain aspects. Now, that's only one experiment, and it was also mentioned a couple of times that what we're doing right now in these trials is throwing like everything at it, throwing every possible measurement technique at it, and that can lead to signals you see. But what's maybe getting at your point about like a research agenda or some kind of roadmap to nailing the future priorities down is, a couple of people mentioned, now we need to eventually strike things off the list, like strike measurements off the list that, you know, are not that valuable, or we're throwing everything at it right now in order to know what's valuable. But this type, like the set of hypotheses or the set of coordinated exercises that will enable that striking off the list, I think is sort of the next step that we need to align upon.
Okay. I'm actually, especially on the MRV side, at the bottom. Because,
oh, yeah? Interesting.
Yeah, I think what's missing on the MRV side to some extent, I mean, when you see that data that we can measure something,
yeah,
I mean, cool. But for me, what's lacking there at the minute is that we don't have a bigger concept of how to approach this. Because is it really the plan that we have, I don't know, if that's running at scale, we have thousands of operations going on, and everyone is trying to measure alkalinity in seawater and how much it increases against a massively variable background and all the complexities that we see there. So I think at the minute I'm like a bit disillusioned about MRV because we haven't figured out a greater concept on how to approach it in a way that's realistic. Because of course we can do lots of good science around it at the minute and see, okay, can we trace the alkalinity we add? It's a bit like an Easter egg hunt, right? So we hide the Easter egg somewhere, and then we try to try our sensors, basically our kids, to find them. And when we don't find them, we know they're still there, right? But we just realized, oh, damn, our kids are not smart enough to find the Easter eggs, right? And maybe if we're unlucky, a squirrel has taken one. But I think the bigger concept, I just don't know where's the plan.
I think that's kind of what I mean, though. It's like that's what the next phase is. But I think about it maybe more optimistically, as in we have these initial approaches to, do a small Easter egg hunt. And then over time, you're going to get smarter. But we can't do that forever. And we can't do that for every trial. So what is that bigger plan? What's the bigger plan we work towards? And I think we had a number of sort of perspectives also shared today from even things like other incentives, like policy frameworks that wouldn't even necessitate ton-based like quantification. But I wonder, you said something a couple of sentences ago about the hype cycle and sort of hitting the bottom. And Naeem, I wonder if there are other examples from other CDR methods even, or maybe also other industries that you thought of today or would draw from where you feel like that has happened to others and there was a positive learning curve from that.
Well, I think that's happening across the carbon removal space right now.
Generally.
Generally, right? And I think so it's not specific to OAE. I mean, we're seeing some news about Climeworks recently in the DAC facility in Iceland. We're seeing just a general drop-off of funding for carbon removal from at least a policy support standpoint. Buyers in the carbon removal field, like we've had some great buyers in the field, but the number of buyers aren't increasing. So there's like a lot of different ways we can look at this that we can see like, okay, things are slowing down. And so it's actually, we don't have a very good precedent for this other than to say like the need is now to really focus and prioritize on how we're going to use the resources that we have to solve the big questions, right? Yeah. And so it's going to force us to focus across the industry, and I think it's going to force us to get really specific around what questions need to be answered and kind of in what sequence, right? And what are the biggest kind of barriers to getting us there? And I don't think these conversations have not been had before, but I just think that we're facing a different context right now where climate in general is like facing off against issues that it wasn't a couple of years ago, geopolitical, AI, like all these other things, affordability that were not as top of agenda a couple of years ago. So this is true across the climate space and particularly in carbon removal. And so establishing, I think, an updated roadmap for where kind of research needs to be directed to answer some of the biggest questions in this field, it's just the right time it seems to me to update that. But unfortunately, like I think this is, well, I should say fortunately and unfortunately, I think this is true across carbon removal methods and not just OAE.
Yeah. Speaking of that, the afternoon session that we just came out of talked about gnarly problems and sort of actionable visions for the next 24 months, where I think around 10, maybe 12 people shared brief pitches of what they think across the nonprofit and the for-profit world we should be focusing our attention towards in the next 24 months. And I think there were a couple of themes that people talked about. I wonder if any one of you felt like there was one that particularly stood out to you or that you didn't immediately agree with in a way.
I think what the afternoon sessions brought up for me was this kind of challenging the idea that existing carbon markets or how we do things with the voluntary carbon market or even compliance markets are the right way to pay for OAE. Like, does that make sense? And I think that's what I liked about the afternoon session was that I think there were some ideas brought up that really challenged the way we're thinking. Like, Noah Deich kind of challenging us to think outside the box about new funding pathways for OAE that, can still make people money, but we're not talking about getting really, really precise around credits generated and MRV because it's not based on that aspect, but there's something else there. And then also like the presentation by Carbon Gap around integration of OAE in CRCF and like maybe an eventual kind of integration with ETS. And, that's really interesting and exciting, but also makes me wonder, like, how far are we from OAE realistically working in regulated compliance markets and not as like something you'd buy in a voluntary carbon market, but like actually within existing carbon pricing systems and the markets attached to those. And I don't think it came out of that with like an answer, but more kind of questions. And
and I think that was the point of that session as well, right? It was like to spur discussion and keep people thinking about new perspectives and new ways. Going
into like kind of the conversations tomorrow, I hope that we can kind of keep that top of mind, because I think you're right. Like I feel like we default to the concept of, you know, carbon credits and kind of how we've thought about carbon offsets in the past, and maybe that makes sense for things like direct air capture, and it doesn't for something like OAE. I don't know, but it's worth rethinking before we go really far down that road.
I think it's worth rethinking, and at the same time, we also need to keep in mind that, which was another theme, I would say, from the actionable vision, in the absence or in the, I guess, reduction of available funding also in this space, we also need to keep in mind that the commercial approaches right now are still conducting really important scientific research as well, and provide an opportunity to get some of the answers that we really need to get. And we are sort of operating, I think, in a limited, like we don't have an abundance of as many field trials as we could possibly want and need, right? Like we are operating in imperfect scenarios. And while I definitely also came out of that session with an interest and motivation to think about these different sort of policy scenarios or just scenarios where basically accounting and measuring 1 ton in order to get 1 credit of 1 ton is not the most ideal way to think about OAE. It's still the most immediate future that is taking place. And so I'm also really excited about the conversations tomorrow in order to find out how, as Naeem said, that can be merged with community approaches, how that can be merged with really solid science, in order to make data emerge from those approaches that helps us generally assess the safety and efficacy of OAE. You both mentioned the workshops tomorrow, and maybe before we close it out and head up to the roof to enjoy a little bit of the evening sun, what are you both particularly excited to discuss further in those workshops? And maybe we've already covered a little bit of it, but to maybe plant a seed for a future episode or a topic we can pick up on. What should we, expect to go home with after tomorrow, I suppose?
I think it'll be useful to just learn a bit more about where we currently are and where we need to go around environmental safety and how we talk about that as relates to OAE. Because it's a question that comes up a lot. And it's not one that I feel particularly well equipped to answer. And I think it's going to be something that comes up more and more as OAE becomes, more visible. And so for me, that's just something that I'm particularly curious about.
Yeah, I hope we can kind of progress the environmental safety assessment to some extent, and not only look at our standard approaches to assess it, but like really, I think in order to assess it properly, and that's where we're in a critical phase right now for OAE. I think we need to understand how it could realistically unfold, because only then we can correctly do the environmental assessment. And I think a better environmental assessment needs to understand how it would unfold and how diverse OAE also is, right? We're not like this is an umbrella term for a range of different methods, and they all have different implications. So I hope we get into that space a bit more tomorrow. We'll see.
Cool. So, closing question. Naeem, of all the ideas discussed at the convening, is there a particular one that you'd be excited about sort of diving deeper into on a future episode? Or what do you think in the context of the carbon curve and your broader topics there, are you excited to follow up on in, I don't know, 3 months, 6 months, a year? You mentioned environmental safety, but I'm curious if there's maybe...
Yeah, there definitely is. Like I came away feeling really excited about the state of the field and the progress that's been made scientifically. The question that I ask, is how are we going to pay for any form of carbon removal? Mm-hmm. And so I'm interested in the question of like, what are different kind of ways to finance scale up of OAE, which, by the way, outside of the traditional carbon market thinking, not to say that that doesn't have a role to play, but I think we can all agree that when we talk about how we're going to pay for carbon removal through compliance markets and the voluntary carbon market, that may still not be enough, right? And so if that's the case, what are some other ways to pay for OAE at large scale? And it doesn't mean that we need to implement these ideas, but it's interesting to start thinking about like what are other pathways to pay for carbon removal methods that are not just about the carbon accounting. This is something I'm curious about with ERW as well, for example, enhanced rock weathering. But I think that stands for OAE too, as a personal curiosity and something that I'd love to be checking in on 3 months or 6 months or next year on, and to see how much progress we've made in our thinking on that.
Yeah, I feel like something we haven't mentioned yet so far, but we had a keynote address from Kim Stanley Robinson, who's a science fiction author, and it was, I thought, a really interesting exercise, and just an interesting mind game to think about the what ifs that no one really wants to think about. But I think it's a really good exercise. Just let's take a step back, as you also said, Leonard. I have a closing question for Leonard that just came to me. Both you and I were going to head next week to Liège in Belgium, and we're going to have another 4 days of pure OAE science conversations. I, for one, am really excited for that week. Lots of the people that are in the room today are going to be there, plus many more who are really deep in the academic literature and are really, the ones that are moving or advancing our knowledge on OAE safety and efficacy. And so I wonder, for next week, what non-scientific, insights do you think you may, share with attendees of the Liège colloquium next week that you took away from the conversations today?
The Liège meeting will be very academic, I suppose. The nice thing about the convening here is that there's not only academics, there's in fact probably more people from the other side. How do I call other non-academics? I'm so much in the ivory tower, I don't even know how to... other people and scientists. Just to get to, when you're in the ivory tower, you often disconnect to some extent. And this is a great place to reconnect to the reality of not only OAE, but the carbon world in general. So it's absolutely essential in order to ground truth your own research. Are you actually doing the right thing? Are you barking up the wrong tree? Or are you working on something that is relevant in the real world? And for that, I think this meeting is particularly great. And hopefully we can bring some of that spirit over to Belgium. Great.
Yeah, that's I think a very nice way of putting it. Any last thoughts from your end, Naeem?
It's been a really educational day for me, and I'm looking forward to the conversations going forward. But, again, I think I felt that way too, that the conversations today, I think, balance the kind of academic rigor with like kind of bumping up against the real world and seeing what's really applicable. And, the event, I think, struck a good balance there. So that was really great to see.
Cool. Thank you both so much. This was fun. Thank you for taking the time right after this day full of information and packed presentations, etc. And I think it was really nice to sit down and reflect together. Thank you to our listeners, and let's go to the rooftop.
Yay.
Thanks.
Thank you.